The letter was already shaking in Clark Walker's hands before he finished the first line. He had read the opening sentence, stopped, pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose so hard the skin whitened, and then started again from the beginning. The woman standing in the doorway of his office watched him do this without moving, without speaking, without allowing herself to breathe in any way that might shatter the fragile silence holding the room together. She had carried that letter across 400 miles of dust and scrubland and late autumn wind. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the dark of various boarding houses, telling herself she would be calm, that she would explain everything clearly and without emotion. But watching Clark Walker read the letter a second time, watching the color leave his face in slow, unmistakable degrees, she felt the rehearsed words dissolve entirely. He looked up. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of morning cloud but the hard gray of flint struck cold, the kind of gray that had seen things it could not unsee. He was broader through the shoulders than she had imagined from the description she had been given, and younger than she had expected, though there were lines around his mouth that did not belong to a young man. He was the kind of man who had been asked to carry more than his share for long enough that it had rearranged his face. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he folded the letter along its original creases, very carefully, the way a man folds something he intends to keep, and he set it on the desk in front of him. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. He said it the way a person says something when they need a moment, and they have chosen honesty over courtesy about needing it. Harriet Hurst sat down. She placed her traveling bag beside her feet and folded her hands in her lap and waited, because she had spent the better part of 3 months learning that waiting was the only currency that bought anything in this territory. Outside the single window of the Redemption Creek town marshal's office, the main street of the town was doing what it always did at 4 in the afternoon, moving, shouting, creaking under the weight of wagons and horses, and the particular kind of commerce that only existed in a place where the law had arrived too recently to have fully taken hold. A dog barked somewhere. A hammer struck iron. The wind pushed a tumble of dried brush against the building's outer wall, and the whole structure muttered in response. Clark Walker stood up and walked to the window and stood with his back to her. "How long ago did he write it?" he asked. "7 weeks before he died," Harriet said. "Gave it to a freighter named Cobb to hold until I came through Laramie. I came through Laramie 6 weeks ago." "Where have you been for 6 weeks?" "Looking for Redemption Creek," she said. "It does not appear on any map I could obtain in Laramie." He turned from the window. There was something complicated moving across his face, grief and guilt, and something else she could not name yet, something that sat behind the other two emotions like a third figure standing just outside the light. "No," he said. "It would not." He came back to the desk and sat down again, and he picked up the letter again, and she understood then that he was not going to read it a third time, he was just holding it, the way a person holds the last physical object that connects them to someone who is gone. "His name was Thomas," she said quietly. "In case the letter did not, in case you needed to hear it said aloud." Clark Walker closed his eyes. "I know his name," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that contains a whole history inside it. Harriet Hurst had come from Ohio, originally, which was a fact that felt increasingly irrelevant the further west she had traveled. She was 26 years old. She had brown hair that she wore pinned at the back of her neck in a style that was practical without quite surrendering to severity, and eyes that people described as green until they looked carefully, at which point they usually revised their assessment to something closer to amber. She was not a large woman, but she carried herself with the kind of posture that made a room register her presence, the habit of a woman who had learned early that presence was the only reliable protection she had. She had met Thomas Briggs in the spring of 1881, in the waiting room of a solicitor's office in Columbus. They had both been waiting to settle the estates of people they had lost, she her father, he a distant uncle whose existence he had only just discovered. They had spoken for 20 minutes while waiting for their respective appointments. He had made her laugh twice. She had made him think, which he told her later was rarer for him than laughter. He had written to her every week for 8 months after that single meeting. She had written back. Their correspondence had been one of those rare exchanges in which two people discover, through the careful medium of written language, that they are genuinely curious about each other. Not the performed curiosity of courtship, but the real kind, the kind that wants to know what the other person thinks about difficult things. He had proposed by letter in November of 1881. She had accepted by letter. He had told her he would be back in Ohio by spring, that he needed one more season out west to settle the business he was in with his partner, a man named Clark Walker, whom he described as the most stubborn and most reliable human being he had ever encountered. He had told her that Clark had saved his life once, in circumstances he would explain in person, and that once he was home they would all three have dinner and she would understand everything. He did not come back in spring. The letter she had received instead had been from the county physician in a town near Laramie, informing her that a man named Thomas Briggs had died of a fever in February of 1882, that his effects had been sent to a forwarding address he had listed, and that if she had any claim to those effects she should make it known. She had written to every authority she could reach in the territory. She had received almost no response. She had written to Clark Walker at 3 different addresses Thomas had mentioned over the course of their correspondence, and not one letter had found him. Then the freighter named Cobb had turned up in Columbus in August, 5 months after Thomas had died, with the letter Thomas had written and the instructions to deliver it personally to a Miss Harriet Hurst, and suddenly she had understood that waiting in Ohio was not going to give her any of the answers she needed. The letter was in 2 parts. The first part was a love letter. It was honest and unguarded, and it had broken her heart to read it, because it was the voice of a man who had believed completely that he would be alive to say these things in person, and the gap between his certainty and what had actually happened felt like the cruelest thing the universe had ever arranged. The second part was something else entirely. Thomas Briggs had written, in a careful hand that was slightly different from the first part, more deliberate, as if he had paused and thought carefully before picking up the pen again, that there was something Harriet needed to know, that the business he and Clark Walker had been conducting was not entirely what he had led her to believe, that there was a man named Dillon Prout who had been threatening both of them for the better part of a year, that Dillon Prout believed Clark and Thomas had cheated him out of a land claim that was worth considerably more than any of them had initially understood, and that this belief, whether true or false, had driven Prout to a level of obsession that Thomas could no longer dismiss as the ordinary grievances of a difficult business partner. Thomas had written that if Harriet was reading this letter, then something had happened to him, and that he needed her to find Clark Walker, because Clark needed to know about the threat even if he already knew about Prout. Because there were details Thomas had kept from Clark, trying to protect him, and those details were in the second half of the letter, and Clark needed to have them. He had also written, in a single line at the very end that Harriet had read a dozen times and still could not fully interpret, "Harriet, forgive me for asking you to do this, but Clark is the only honest man I have ever trusted with anything that mattered, and you are the only person I have ever loved. The two of you being in the same room together is the closest I will be able to get to being there myself." She had folded the letter. She had bought a train ticket to Cheyenne, and she had started moving west. "You read the whole thing," Harriet said. "It was not quite a question." "Yes," Clark said. "Then you know about Prout." He set the letter down again and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. It was the expression of a man who was deciding how much honesty was owed to a stranger. "I know about Prout," he said. "I've known about Prout for longer than Thomas apparently thought I did. He was trying to protect you. I know that too." Something shifted in his voice, rough and controlled at the same time. That was Thomas. That was exactly Thomas. The silence came back. Harriet let it. "He loved you very much," she said, because it seemed like the right thing to say and because it was true. Clark Walker looked at her and she saw, briefly and unmistakably, the grief in him, not the composed grief of a man who had had time to arrange it into something manageable, but the raw kind, the kind that is still looking for somewhere to go. "I know," he said, and his voice was rough with it. "I loved him too." He stood up again. He seemed to have trouble staying in one place, which she recognized as a physical symptom of an emotional state that had no comfortable outlet. He walked to the window again, then stopped and turned. "You came all the way from Ohio," he said. It was somewhere between a question and a statement of disbelief. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." "That is an extraordinary thing to do," he said. "Thomas asked me to," she said simply. "And he did not ask me to do things for no reason." Clark Walker studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze without difficulty. She had been looked at by difficult men for the past several months. This was different from most of those looks. Most of those looks had been calculating or dismissive or both. This one was something more like recognition, the way a person looks at something they did not expect to find but whose existence immediately makes sense to them. "He wrote about you," Clark said, "in his letters to me. He wrote about a woman in Ohio who made him feel like his life had a shape." Harriet felt the grief move through her in a wave that she absorbed without showing it, which cost her something. "He wrote about you as well," she said. "Frequently, he said you were the most stubborn man he had ever met." "He was not wrong," Clark said. It was not a smile. It was too sad for a smile. But it was something adjacent to one, and it was the first softening she had seen in his face, and she registered it without naming it because it was too early to name anything. Clark Walker was 29 years old, which Harriet would not learn until later. He had been born in Missouri, had come west at 17 with the particular recklessness of a boy who believed that physical distance from everything that had hurt him was a form of healing. He had spent 2 years driving cattle, 1 year working for a survey team, and 3 years doing various things that the law had recently classified as occupations before he had landed, through a sequence of events that involved both luck and genuinely hard work, in the position of marshal of Redemption Creek. Redemption Creek was not a large town. It had a main street, a hotel, a livery, 2 saloons of varying respectability, a dry goods store, a blacksmith, a church that also served as a school 3 days per week, and approximately 240 people who had arrived there from various directions and various degrees of desperation, and were in the collective process of deciding whether it was going to become a real place or dissolve back into the landscape. Clark had been the marshal for 14 months. Before that, he and Thomas Briggs had been operating as land agents, identifying parcels of territory that the Federal Survey hadn't yet cataloged, negotiating the claims, selling them to incoming settlers at a fair margin. It was mostly honest work. The part that was not honest had involved Dylan Prout, and the details of that were complicated in ways that Clark had spent the better part of a year trying to unknot. The short version was this. Prout had identified a parcel of land near the junction of 2 creek systems, had made a verbal agreement with Clark and Thomas to jointly file the claim, and then had disappeared for 8 months, during which time Clark and Thomas had filed the claim independently, believing Prout had abandoned his interest, and then sold it. When Prout had reappeared, the land had already passed to settlers. Prout believed he had been deliberately cheated. Clark maintained that they had waited as long as was legally reasonable, and that Prout had forfeited his interest by disappearing. The reality, as Clark understood it, sat somewhere in an uncomfortable middle. They had not acted in bad faith, but they had not been sorry enough when the outcome worked in their favor. What Thomas had apparently known and not told Clark, which Clark now understood from the letter, was that Prout had not simply disappeared. Prout had been in a territorial prison for 8 months on charges that had since been dropped, and he had documentation of this that he had been brandishing at every authority he could find, trying to have the land sale reversed. He had not succeeded legally, but the documentation changed the moral shape of the situation considerably, and its existence was the detail Thomas had kept from Clark out of a misguided protective impulse. Knowing this now, Clark felt the weight of it settle onto the existing weight of Thomas's death and press down until his chest ached with it. He needed to deal with Prute. He had needed to deal with Prute for some time, actually, but had been doing so in the way that a man deals with something he does not have all the information about carefully and incompletely, keeping a watchful distance and waiting to understand the full shape of it before acting. Now he had the full shape of it delivered by a woman from Ohio who had traveled 400 miles because Thomas Briggs had asked her to. The least he could do was be grateful. "You must be tired," he said. "You need a room." "I will manage," Harriet said. "The hotel on the main street is clean. Mrs. Alcott runs it and she is a fair woman. I will speak to her." "You do not need to." "I know I do not need to," he said. "I want to." She looked at him. He looked back. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He picked up his hat from the peg behind the door and held it in his hands and said, "Miss Hurst, I am glad Thomas had someone like you. I am sorry for what you lost." She stood up and picked up her traveling bag. "I am sorry for what you lost as well," she said. "He clearly loved you like a brother." Clark Walker nodded once tightly, in the way of a man who will not come undone in front of someone he met 40 minutes ago, even though all of his instincts are telling him that this particular woman would not be unkind about it if he did. They went out into the afternoon together. The hotel room was clean, as Clark had promised, and Mrs. Alcott was indeed a fair woman, a widow in her late 50s with a brisk manner and perceptive eyes who asked Harriet no questions she did not want to be asked, which Harriet appreciated more than she could express. She washed the road off herself and lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas, which she had been trying not to do during the traveling because grief and movement made poor companions and she had needed to move. Now she was still, and the grief came, and she let it come. She had loved Thomas Briggs in the way you love someone through letters, which is a real kind of love. She believed that. She had always believed that. But it was a love that had been waiting to be confirmed in person, waiting to be given the full weight of physical presence and shared space and the ordinary textures of a shared life, and it had never gotten that chance. The love existed, but it had never been finished, and the unfinished quality of it was perhaps the sharpest part of the pain. She thought about what he had written at the end of the letter, about Clark being the only honest man he had ever trusted, and her being the only person he had ever loved, and his wanting them in the same room together because it was as close as he could get to being there himself. She thought about what that meant. She thought about whether Thomas had been doing what she suspected he might have been doing, and then she thought that it was much too early to think about that, and then she thought about Clark Walker's gray eyes and his careful hands holding the letter and the way his voice had roughened when he said, "I loved him too," and she made herself stop thinking. She slept. In the morning she came down to the hotel's small dining area and found Clark Walker sitting at one of the tables, his hat on the seat beside him, drinking coffee. He was watching the door, which meant he had come here to meet her, which meant he had not slept much and had been thinking about the letter and had decided he needed to talk. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. "What are you going to do about Prute?" she asked. He looked mildly surprised that she had opened with that and not with a good morning, and then he looked like he had decided that this was exactly right. "I am going to find him," Clark said. "And I am going to have an honest conversation with him. Do you know where he is?" "I have a general sense of it. There is a settlement about 20 miles east. He has been seen there." Mrs. Alcott's daughter, a girl of about 16, brought Harriet a cup of coffee and a plate of cornbread without being asked, which Harriet accepted with gratitude. "The letter changes things," Harriet said. "Yes." "What Thomas wrote about Prute being in prison when you filed the claim. Does that change what you plan to say to him?" Clark looked at his coffee cup. "It changes everything I plan to say to him," he said. "We were not acting in bad faith, but we did not have the whole picture. And when a man acts without the whole picture and benefits from it, He owes something to the person who was disadvantaged, even if the law does not require it. What would you owe him? The land is gone, the settlers have been there for 2 years, they have built homes, but there is value in the claim we made. There was a payment from the sale, he paused. A portion of that is in my keeping still. It was always half Thomas's, and now Thomas's, it would go to his estate, which appears to consist of a single heir, which is you. Harriet went still. Thomas put me in his will, she said. He updated it last October, Clark said. I am named as executor. I have the paperwork. He looked at her directly. I realize this is a great deal to receive in one sitting on a Tuesday morning. It was. She breathed steadily and considered it. How much? She asked. He told her. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was enough to start something, or return to something, or build something. It was more than she had. The portion I believe we owe to Prout, Clark said, is already set aside. What is left is yours by right and by Thomas's instructions. Harriet looked at this man, at the straightness of his posture, the careful honesty of his face, the absence of any flinching in his eyes, and she understood completely why Thomas Briggs had trusted him. You did not have to do that, she said. You could have kept it, I would not have known. I know, Clark said, but I would have known. They sat in a silence that was different from all the silences of the day before, less jagged, less afraid of itself. He was right about you, Harriet said. He was right about you too, Clark said, and she saw the honesty in it, and it made something shift in her chest in a way she was not quite ready to examine. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Harriet did not leave Redemption Creek, though she had no particular reason to stay. She told herself she was resting after the journey. She told herself she was waiting to receive the paperwork Clark had mentioned. She told herself various things, none of which were lies exactly, but none of which were the complete truth either. The complete truth was that she was finding Redemption Creek more interesting than she had expected, and she was finding Clark Walker more interesting than she had expected, and she was not quite ready to get back on a stagecoach and return to a life that had recently lost its main organizing principle. On the first day she explored the town, which did not take long but which she did carefully, reading its character the way she read everything carefully. She introduced herself to the blacksmith, a large and gentle man named Elias who had migrated from Tennessee, and to the woman who ran the dry goods store, a Mrs. Pearl Chen, who had come from San Francisco 15 years ago, and who spoke 3 languages and had opinions about everything, which Harriet found enormously refreshing after months of being on the road among people who regarded curiosity in a woman as mildly suspicious. On the second day, she went to the marshal's office because she had a question about the paperwork, and stayed for 3 hours because Clark Walker was unexpectedly easy to talk to when he was not in the process of receiving devastating news. He made a second pot of coffee and they talked about Thomas for a while, which was painful but necessary, and then they talked about other things. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about the things he had seen in the first years out west, about the territory and its particular beauty and its particular cruelty, about the town and the people in it, and what he was trying to make of it. She told him about Ohio, about her father, about the books she had read and the opinions she had formed, about the way the world seemed to be moving very quickly toward something new, and she was not always certain she was keeping pace. He listened to her with the full attention of a person who finds what the other person is saying genuinely interesting, which was not common in Harriet's experience. Most people listened to fill in the gaps between their own turns to speak. Clark listened as though the information itself mattered, as though he was storing it somewhere useful. On the third day, he took her out to see the land around the town, which he said she should know before she left since she had come all this way, and the country here was worth seeing. He rode a large roan horse named Gabriel and provided her with a gentle gray mare from the livery. They rode out to the north where the plains opened up into a wide, breathtaking expanse of late October grass, gold and amber under the thin western sun, and she understood then what Thomas had been trying to say in his letters when he described the landscape. You could not fully communicate what this light did to this grass at this particular angle of afternoon. You just had to be in it. "It is beautiful," she said. "Yes," Clark agreed, and he was not looking at the land when he said it. She pretended not to notice, because it was too soon to notice, because there were still too many layers of loss between them, and anything as new and as fragile as what was beginning to form would need very careful handling or it would break. On the fourth day, the situation with Dylan Prout became urgent. Clark came to the hotel early in the morning, early enough that the sun was still barely risen, still laying long cold shadows across the main street, and knocked on her door, and when she opened it he said, quietly and without preamble, "Prout is in town." She was dressed in 2 minutes. She was not certain later why she felt it was her business to be involved, except that it was, because Thomas had sent her here for exactly this, because the letter had named Prout as a threat, and she had carried that information across 400 miles, and she was not about to sit in a hotel room while it played out without her. Clark did not argue with her about this, which she noted. He simply said, "Stay behind me," and she said, "I will be wherever I need to be," and he looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between exasperation and appreciation, and led her out into the street. Dylan Prout was standing in front of the marshal's office. He was a man in his mid-40s, lean and weathered, with the kind of stillness in him that is not peace but the opposite of peace, the stillness of something coiled. He was wearing a coat that had once been good quality and had since been lived in hard. He was not visibly armed, which Clark noted and which Harriet noted him noting. "Walker," Prout said. "Prout," Clark said. His voice was level, not threatening, not warm, honest. "I heard you got a visitor." Prout's eyes moved to Harriet briefly, assessing. "Thomas Briggs's woman. Miss Hurst came with information I needed," Clark said, "some of which concerns you." Something shifted in Prout's expression. "Is that so?" "I know about the prison sentence," Clark said. "I know you were not gone by choice when we filed the claim. I know you had documentation, and I know we did not have it when we acted. I am prepared to have a conversation about what is owed." The stillness in Prout cracked, not violently, in the way that a dam cracks when pressure has been applied for long enough, a thin line that lets the whole accumulated weight of held water begin to move. "You knew," Prout said, not quite an accusation. Not quite a question. "I know now," Clark said. "I did not know before. If I had known before, we would have had this conversation before. That is the truth." Prout studied him for a long moment. Harriet held herself very still. "Briggs is dead," Prout said finally. "Yes," Clark said, "he is. I heard." Something crossed Prout's face that was not grief exactly but was adjacent to it, the complicated feelings of a man who had been in conflict with another man for a long time and now found that the conflict had been resolved by a means that gave no satisfaction at all. "There is money set aside," Clark said, "a portion of the original sale. It is not the land which I cannot give back, but it is what I can offer, and I believe it is what is right. Come inside, talk to me." Another long pause. Then Prout said, "All right." They went inside. Harriet waited on the steps, and after 20 minutes Clark opened the door and said, "Come in, please. You should hear this." She came in. What happened in the next hour was not a dramatic confrontation. It was something more valuable and considerably less common. 2 men in a room, with a woman as witness, working through the long, uncomfortable process of acknowledging the ways in which the absence of information had led to outcomes that had hurt someone, and trying to determine what honesty and fairness required by way of repair. Prout was not a villain. Clark had known this, she realized, which was why he had wanted to talk to him rather than avoid him. Prout was a man who had been genuinely wronged, not by malice but by circumstance and incomplete information, and who had responded to that wrong with an obsessive bitterness that had consumed 3 years of his life, and had frightened both Clark and Thomas into a defensive posture that had in turn prevented the honest conversation from happening. The letter had broken that cycle. Thomas, from the other side of death, had finally given Clark the information he needed to see Prout clearly. When the conversation was over and the arrangement had been agreed to, the money to be paid over the next 6 months, along with Clark's written acknowledgement of the circumstances, which Prout needed for his own reasons, Prout stood up and looked at Clark with something complicated in his face. "Briggs," he said. "He sent her with the letter." "Yes," Clark said. "He was trying to fix it," Prout said. "Even after everything." "That was Thomas," Clark said, with the same roughness in his voice that she had heard on the first day. Prout nodded once. He put on his hat. He looked at Harriet. "Whatever he told you about me," he said, "I was not planning to hurt anyone. I want that known." "I believe you," Harriet said. She said it because she did. Something in Prout eased. He was not a changed man. She thought the bitterness had too deep a root for an hour's conversation to remove it entirely. But he was a man who had been seen honestly, which was not nothing. He left. Clark sat back in his chair and pressed both hands against his face for a long moment. "Are you all right?" Harriet asked. He lowered his hands. His expression was open in a way she had not seen before, the controlled surface of him stripped back by the emotional weight of the last hour. "I am better than I was this morning," he said, "which is more than I expected to be." She was sitting in the same chair she had occupied on the first day, and the light was at the same afternoon angle through the window, and for a moment the echo of that first day was so strong she could almost hear it, the particular silence of two people who have never met each other, holding the consequences of a shared love. The silence now was entirely different. "You handled that well," she said. "Thomas would have handled it better," Clark said. "He was always better at the human parts than I was." "You did fine," she said. "You were honest. That is not a small thing." He looked at her across the desk, and something in his face that had been carefully managed since the first moment she walked through his door relaxed, just slightly, just enough, like a fist slowly unclenching. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for bringing the letter, for staying." "I have not left yet," she said. "No," he said, "you have not." November came to Redemption Creek in its usual way: cold nights, bright days, the particular clarity of air that made distances look smaller than they were. Harriet did not leave. This was not something she had planned. She had planned to collect the paperwork, deal with the Prout matter, and return east with a clearer understanding of how Thomas had died and why, and what he had been trying to say in that letter. She had planned all of this very clearly, and it had dissolved in the actual living of it, the way most careful plans dissolve when they meet the actual texture of a life. She found work. Mrs. Pearl Chen needed someone who could read and write well to help with the accounting side of the dry goods operation, since Pearl's husband had died the previous spring, and the books had gotten away from her. Harriet spent 4 hours every Tuesday and Thursday in the back room of the dry goods store with Pearl's ledgers and a pot of ink, restoring order to the accounts with a satisfaction that surprised her. She also began, almost without intending to help Clark with certain aspects of the marshal's work that required more literacy than he had time for: correspondence with the county sheriff's office, reports that had to be written in a form acceptable to the territorial authority, the occasional reading and summarizing of legal documents that arrived from Cheyenne. Clark was not incompetent with written language, but he was slow and deliberate with it in a way that reflected a formal education that had been cut short, and Harriet was fast and precise, and the arrangement made practical sense. It also meant she spent a great deal of time in the marshal's office. Clark Walker at work was a different creature from Clark Walker in a private conversation. At work he was efficient, decisive, unsentimental, not unkind, but focused in a way that allowed no sentimentality. He knew every person in his town by name and by circumstance, and he treated each of them with a consistency that was neither warm nor cold, but something steadier than both, something like the ground itself. She watched him mediate a dispute between two neighboring homesteaders whose fence line had migrated 3 feet into contentious territory, and she watched him speak to a man who had been drinking heavily since his wife had died in September, and she watched him organize the town's response to a chimney fire at the schoolhouse that threatened 2 adjacent buildings, And in all of these things, she saw the same quality. A person who was exactly where he was, doing exactly what needed doing, without drama and without hesitation. She admired it. She also saw the things underneath it. She saw the nights he came into the hotel dining room for supper with a tiredness in his eyes that went deeper than physical fatigue. She saw the way he sometimes paused in the middle of a sentence when something reminded him of Thomas, pressing through the pause and continuing without naming what had caused it. She saw the way he was with the town's children, careful, patient, unexpectedly gentle, and she saw the way he handled that gentleness afterward, folding it back into his controlled exterior as if gentleness were a vulnerability that needed to be monitored. She began to understand that Clark Walker was a man who had spent a long time being very careful about what he let himself want. Not because he was cold. She was beginning to understand that he was in fact the opposite of cold, that the controlled surface was a management tool for something considerably more intense. But because the things he had wanted and not gotten had left their marks on him, and wanting something new required a courage he was still assembling. She recognized this because she was in the process of assembling the same courage herself. 3 weeks after Harriet had arrived in Redemption Creek, Clark came to find her at the dry goods store in the late afternoon with his hat in his hand, and an expression she had not seen before, uncertain, which looked genuinely unusual on him, like a hat that did not quite fit. "I have a question," he said. Pearl Chen was in the back room but could almost certainly hear through the doorway, which Clark appeared to be aware of and to have decided did not matter. "Ask it," Harriet said. "There is a gathering at the Alcott's place on Friday evening," he said. "Several families from the town, music, supper. I usually do not attend these things, but—" He stopped. "I would like to attend this one with you if you are willing." Harriet looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to accompany you to a social gathering?" "Yes," he said. "That is what I am asking." From the back room, Pearl made a small sound that was absolutely not a cough. "I would like that," Harriet said. Something in Clark's expression shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of a man who has been holding his breath and now releases it, but in a smaller and more private way, a kind of careful warmth moving across his face like the light moving across the plain's grass, changing the color of things without disrupting their form. "Good," he said. "Friday, then." He put his hat back on and went out into the street. Pearl came out of the back room immediately. "That man," Pearl said, "has not attended a social gathering since he arrived in this town." "I know," Harriet said. "He is interested," Pearl said. "I know that too," Harriet said, and went back to the ledgers, but she was smiling at the pages in a way that had nothing to do with the accounts. Friday evening came cold and clear, the kind of November night where the stars appeared very sharp and very close against the black sky, and the warmth of indoors felt like something earned. The Alcott's parlor had been opened up to include the adjoining dining room, and perhaps 30 people had gathered, which was a significant proportion of the town. There was a fiddle player, and a man with a squeeze box producing the kind of music that invited the feet to move. There was food on long tables, venison stew and corn bread, and a remarkable apple cake that Mrs. Elias had apparently been planning for 2 weeks. Clark arrived at the hotel to collect Harriet and stood in the lobby holding his hat with both hands while she came down the stairs, and she watched his face do the thing it was beginning to do with some regularity. The careful, controlled appreciation, the managing of something that wanted to be more visible than he was allowing it. She was wearing a dark green dress she had bought from Pearl's store the previous week. It was not fancy, but it was well made and it fit her properly, which after months of traveling in practical clothes felt like a luxury. "You look very fine," he said. He said it simply, without decoration, the way he said everything true. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." He did. He was wearing a dark coat she had not seen before, and he had combed his hair, and the combination of these things with his gray eyes and the particular way he stood balanced, watchful, taking up exactly as much space as he needed, and no more made him very handsome in the uncomplicated way of a person who does not work at it. They walked to the Alcott's together through the cold night air. Inside, warm and bright with lamplight and the smell of good food and rosin from the fiddle bow, Harriet was introduced to people she had not yet met and reintroduced to people she had. She watched Clark in company and found that he was known and liked here in a quiet way, not the way of a man who commands a room, but the way of a man whom the room trusts, which is a different and rarer thing. They danced once. It was a simple reel, the kind that does not require much proximity or much skill, which was good because Harriet had not danced in a long time and Clark, by his own cheerful admission as they took their position, had never been a skilled dancer. They were not graceful together, but they were in time with each other, which was something. And when the music required them to face each other and step together, there were 3 or 4 seconds in which they were very close and looking at each other, and both aware of the closeness, in a way that made the warmth of the room feel different. Later they stood near the window with cups of apple cider and talked, and the talking was easy in the way that talking had become easy between them. No longer the careful navigation of grief and strangers, but the natural exchange of 2 people who had decided, without exactly deciding it, that the other person was someone worth knowing. He told her about Missouri again, but differently from the first time, more detail, more honesty. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and his father, who had been a difficult man whom Clark had eventually understood better than he had managed to forgive. He told her about the decision to go west, which he described as running away, but then he said he had come to believe there were things you could only find by running, which did not justify running, but complicated the condemnation of it. She told him about her father in more detail. About the bookshop they had run together out of a building in Columbus, about the way she had grown up surrounded by books that belonged to other people, and had developed the habit of reading them before they were collected, which her father had encouraged and which had given her, she said, an entirely unrealistic expectation of how interesting real life could be. "And is it?" Clark asked. "Interesting." "Considerably more than I expected," she said, and she let her eyes rest on his for a moment longer than the sentence required. He looked back and she saw the careful warmth again, and underneath the warmth something more direct and more urgent that he was managing carefully, and she thought, this man is going to say something. Not tonight. Not yet. But soon. Good, she thought, because she was going to need to hear it. November became December. Harriet wrote a letter to a friend in Columbus explaining that she was staying through the winter for reasons she did not fully have words for yet. She did not expect the letter to be believed entirely, and she was correct. A responding letter arrived in 3 weeks expressing considerable and cheerful suspicion, demanding detailed explanations, and containing the sentence, "I hope he has good eyes and a good heart, because the combination of those 2 things in a man is rarer than gold and considerably more useful." Clark had both. She had checked. She had also come to understand, in the accumulating days and weeks of proximity, that the situation was not without its complications. The most significant complication was that she had come to Redemption Creek as the woman Thomas Briggs had loved, and Clark had loved Thomas, and the feelings that were growing between her and Clark carried that weight in them, not as a reason to refuse those feelings, but as a texture, a layer of tenderness and grief that was inextricably woven into the warmth. She thought about this often. She also believed, with increasing certainty, that Thomas had thought about it too, that the last line of his letter had not been innocent, had not been simply an expression of sorrow at not being there himself. He had put them in each other's paths deliberately. He had known Clark's character, had known Harriet's character, and he had done what he could from the only position he had available to him. She both loved him for it and was slightly exasperated by it, which seemed like the right emotional ratio for Thomas Briggs. One evening in early December, she was sitting in the marshal's office after Clark had finished his rounds, working by lamplight on a letter that needed to go to the county sheriff. When Clark came back in from the cold and stood near the stove warming his hands and said, without preamble or apparent planning, "Harriet." She looked up. "I need to say something," he said. "And I have been not saying it for several weeks because the timing has seemed wrong or the situation has seemed too complicated, but I have come to believe that waiting for the right moment is sometimes just another word for not saying it, and I do not want to be the kind of man who does not say things." She put down the pen. "All right," she said. He turned from the stove to face her. "I know how you came here," he said. "I know what you came from. I know you loved Thomas, and I know that what you lost is not a small thing, and I am not asking you to put it aside or to pretend it is not real." He paused, collecting himself with the particular precision of a man who has thought very carefully about what he wants to say. "But I find that another pause. I find that you are the person I think about when I am not thinking about anything else. I find that this town is more like home since you have been in it. I find that I am looking for you when you are not there." He stopped. "I wanted you to know that. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know." The lamplight made the room warm and gold. Outside, the December wind pressed against the walls. The silence between the last word and her response was only a few seconds long, but it contained a great deal. "Clark," she said, "I did not stay in Redemption Creek because of the bookkeeping." Something moved across his face, relief, she thought, and something deeper than relief, something that had been waiting a long time for permission. "No," he said. "No," she said. "I stayed because you are exactly who Thomas said you were." And because she stopped, then chose honesty the way he had chosen it. "Because since I have been here, I find that I am looking for you too." He crossed the room to her in 2 deliberate steps, and when he reached her he stopped, very close, and looked at her with those gray eyes, and she looked back. And neither of them moved for a moment, and then he raised his hand and touched her face, just his fingertips against her cheek, light and careful, as if she were something valuable, and the touch was so full of everything unsaid that she felt it through her whole chest. "May I?" he started. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was careful and warm and honest, like everything he did, and it was exactly right. And when they separated, she was still holding the pen in her hand, and they both looked at this for a moment. And then Clark laughed, a genuine laugh that broke the dignified seriousness of the moment entirely. And she laughed too, and it was the easiest and most complete feeling she could remember having in a very long time. December settled over Redemption Creek, and the town pulled inward in the way of frontier towns in winter, smaller and warmer, its distances compressed by weather. The social fabric of the place drew tighter, visits between households becoming more regular, the hotel dining room becoming a kind of community center in the evenings when people came in for warmth and company, and Mrs. Alcott's stew. Harriet and Clark moved into something that was not quite courtship in the formal sense. There was no one to call on, no social framework to arrange itself around them, but was courtship in the essential sense. 2 people choosing each other deliberately, in full knowledge of what they were, discovering the other in layered revelations. She learned that he could not cook anything that required more than 3 ingredients, but that he took great care of his horse, his weapons, his tools. Everything he was responsible for he maintained with the same thoroughness he brought to people. She learned that he read, slowly and carefully, mostly history, and the occasional novel that the traveling book trader brought through in spring and fall, and that he had opinions about what he read that were worth arguing with. She learned that he was a man who found it difficult to ask for help, and who was making a sustained effort to change this about himself, because he understood it as a limitation. He learned that she was braver than she appeared, not the showy kind of brave, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that simply continues, that does not make a fuss about continuing. He learned that her composure, which he had initially read as reserve, was in fact something she had assembled out of necessity, and that underneath it she was fierce and funny and occasionally furious, and that she felt things very deeply, and had developed a system of feeling them without appearing to, because appearing to had not always been safe. He found this out on an afternoon in mid-December when they were riding, and she talked about her father's illness, and the year she had spent alone in Columbus managing the shop and paying down the debt he had left and writing to Thomas every week, because the letters were the only thing keeping her oriented. And she said all of this in a calm, steady voice, and he could see the whole history of contained feeling underneath the calm voice. And he said something about it gently, carefully. And she looked at him with a kind of surprise, as if she had not expected to be seen. And then the composure shifted, and something real and unguarded came through, and she cried briefly and without apology. And he held her in a way that required no commentary. And afterward she said, "I'm not usually like this." And he said, "I think you are usually exactly like this, and you do not let anyone see it." And she looked at him for a long moment and said, "That is very perceptive of you." And he said, "Thomas used to tell me I was slow about people. I think I was just slow about the right people." And she understood exactly what he meant. He proposed in January. He did it in the marshal's office, which was probably not the most romantic setting he could have chosen, but it was where they had begun and where they spent most of their working hours together, and it felt right in the way that things feel right when they are true. He had a ring that had been his mother's, brought west with him in a small leather pouch that he had carried for 12 years without a use for it. A simple gold band with a small dark stone, modest and honest, exactly like him. He said, "Harriet, I love you. I want to build something with you. Not just here, not just in Redemption Creek, but a life, a whole life, with all the hard parts and the good parts and everything I can give you and everything you would be willing to give me. I know this is fast. I know there is still a great deal we are both carrying. I do not ask you to put any of it down. I just ask you to let me be beside you while you carry it." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She had known this was coming because she was observant, but hearing it said aloud with his full sincerity behind it still did something to her breathing. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger and then held her hand in both of his and looked at it, and she saw on his face the same expression she had seen when he kissed her, the specific look of a man who has been afraid to want something for a long time and is now confronting the fact that he has gotten it. "Clark," she said. He looked up. "I love you too," she said. "I have been meaning to say it, and I keep finding that I am saying other things instead." "I noticed," he said. "I was patient." "You were very patient," she agreed. He pulled her close and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they stood like that for a while, in the warm office with the winter light coming through the window, and it was very simple and very good. They married in February. The wedding was conducted by the town's minister, Reverend Aldous Ferris, a mild man with an unexpectedly powerful speaking voice, in the church that was also a school. Half the town attended, which was not surprising. Harriet had been in Redemption Creek for 4 months and had made herself necessary to it, and the town had collectively understood for some weeks that the marshal and Miss Hurst were heading in this direction, and there was a general goodwill toward the outcome that expressed itself in the form of a remarkable quantity of food and a dance that lasted until 2 in the morning. Pearl Chen cried and denied it. Elias the blacksmith shook Clark's hand for so long and so vigorously that Clark's expression moved through gratitude, surprise, and a mild concern for the structural integrity of his arm. Mrs. Alcott provided the wedding supper and would not hear of payment, and threatened anyone who suggested otherwise with consequences that were cheerfully unspecified. They stood across from each other in front of Reverend Ferris and said the words that made them married, and Clark held her hands with the same care he brought to everything, and she thought about Thomas briefly, honestly, without guilt, and she thought he would be glad that the last line of his letter had been, in its strange and bittersweet way, the truest gift he could have given either of them. The night was cold and clear and full of stars, and they walked from the church to the house, Clark's house, which was now also hers, a solid 2-room structure at the western edge of town that had been very much a man's house until about 6 weeks ago when she had begun, gently and without fanfare, to add things to it. And the walk was not long, but it was very sweet, cold air and warmth beside her and her hand in his. Spring came. With spring came the ordinary accumulating business of a new life built carefully from its foundations upward. Harriet continued her work with Pearl and her assistants in the marshal's office. Clark continued his work with the town. They fell into the rhythms of a shared household, with more ease than either of them had expected, because they had spent 4 months learning each other's patterns before they had attempted to live inside them together. They argued sometimes, as honest people in close quarters argue, about small things usually, occasionally about large things, always with the commitment to resolution that was one of the things Harriet admired most about Clark: his refusal to let a wound fester, his insistence on talking through the things that were difficult rather than arranging a silence around them. In April, she received a letter from her friend in Columbus containing the sentence, "I take it from the total cessation of letters that you have found your answer, and it has taken up most of your available writing time." She wrote back a long, detailed, entirely insufficient attempt to describe the previous 6 months, which she recognized was insufficient but sent anyway. The Prout matter concluded in June. Clark had been sending the arranged payments over the previous months, with a written acknowledgement of the circumstances that Prout had needed for reasons that became clear when Prout used it, successfully, to have a separate legal matter resolved in his favor, something that had been hanging over his head from the years of his bitterness that the documentation, combined with Clark's letter, helped to settle. When the final payment was made, Prout came to Redemption Creek himself, which Clark had not expected. He came in the late afternoon, which felt intentional. He stood in the door of the marshal's office and looked at Clark and said, "We are square." "We are square," Clark agreed. Prout looked at Harriet, who was at the desk. "Thomas Briggs," Prout said, "sending his woman with that letter." He shook his head, not unkindly. "That is either the smartest thing a man ever did or the strangest." "Both," Harriet said. The corner of Prout's mouth moved in what might generously be called a smile. "Both," he agreed. He left. Clark watched him go and then looked at Harriet, and something in both of them released a breath they had been holding since October. "It is done," Clark said. "It is done," Harriet said. "Thomas," Clark said quietly, not to her, not really to the room, more to the air itself, "would have managed that better and in half the time." "Thomas," Harriet said, "also would have had to make 3 trips and a complicated arrangement with a freighter, and would have put it off for at least 2 more months." Clark looked at her, and the grief in him and the laughter in him existed in the same moment, which was exactly what grief and laughter do when they have been living long enough in the same chest. "Fair," he said. She came around the desk to him and put her arms around him, and he held her close, and they were quiet for a moment, both thinking of Thomas, both grateful, the loss and the love occupying the same space without contradiction. Summer in Redemption Creek was long and hot, and full of the kind of business that summer brought: more travelers, more disputes, more commerce, the town expanding incrementally in the way of places that are genuinely taking root. 2 new families arrived from Kansas in June. A second doctor established himself in a small building near the hotel. The dry goods store gained a competition in the form of a general merchant who set up 2 blocks away, which Pearl regarded with magnificent composure, and which she proceeded to thoroughly outsell through the combination of better relationships and more accurate accounting. In July, Harriet told Clark she was expecting a child. She told him at supper, simply watching his face for the response, and watched him go entirely still in the way of someone receiving information that is simultaneously completely expected and completely overwhelming. He set down his fork. He looked at her. "Harriet," he said. "I know," she said. "We are going to—" "Yes," she said. He got up from the table and came around and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before: uncontrolled joy, the kind that had not been edited by caution or care, just pure and immediate joy breaking through every surface he maintained. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am wonderful, actually." He pressed his forehead against her hands and was quiet for a moment, and she felt the warmth of him and the wholeness of the moment, and she thought, "This is the thing that was waiting. This is the shape that Thomas said he wanted for my life." "I am so glad you came with that letter," Clark said, his voice quiet and rough and entirely honest. "So am I," she said. The child was born in March, the following year. A boy, healthy and loud about being healthy, arriving at 3 in the morning into the competent hands of Dr. Patricia Morse, who had arrived in Redemption Creek in the fall and who had immediately become a person Harriet considered indispensable. They named him Thomas. This was not a decision they had taken lightly or arrived at quickly. They had talked about it with the careful honesty that was the foundation of everything between them, acknowledging the weight and meaning of it, the way it honored a loss they both carried and made it part of what they were building. Thomas Walker, born in Redemption Creek, named for a man who had loved both his parents from the distance of letters and had done the last work he could to bring them together. Clark held the baby with the concentrated expression of a man determined to do something he has never done before with maximum care, and Harriet watched him do this from the bed, tired and warm and overwhelmed with the particular fullness of the moment. And she thought, there it is, there is the thing he keeps inside all the controlled surfaces. There is what he is underneath the marshal and the steady man and the person who runs toward problems rather than away from them. There it is, holding a small boy in the early morning, looking at him like he is the most extraordinary thing the world has ever produced. "He has your eyes," Clark said. "He has your chin," Harriet said. "I hope for his sake he has your disposition," Clark said. "I hope for his sake he has yours," Harriet said. Clark looked at her across the room with the baby in his arms and the lamplight warm around them and outside the March wind coming down off the plains and against the windows. "Thank you," he said, "for everything you are." She shook her head slightly. "I should be thanking you," she said, "for being exactly what the letter said you were." "What did the letter say I was?" "The only honest man Thomas had ever trusted with anything that mattered," she said. Clark looked at the baby and then at her and said nothing for a moment, and the nothing was full of the same things all his silences were full of everything he felt, held carefully, like water in cupped hands, not spilled and not withheld. "He trusted you with the same thing," Clark said. "I know," she said. "He was very perceptive." "He was," Clark said, with the smile that was still slightly too sad for a full smile and always would be, and was exactly right precisely because of that. The years accumulated. Not slowly, Harriet had thought, before she had lived them, that years accumulated slowly. That time was a gradual and patient thing. Instead, it went the way all important time goes, which is to say it moved with its normal speed, but every moment inside it was so full that looking back, it appeared dense, packed with substance, more landscape than the same number of years in a less inhabited life. Thomas grew. He was a bright, sturdy child with an enormous appetite, a quality of curiosity that drove him into trouble with a cheerful regularity, and his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubbornness, which was a combination that promised a very interesting adult. When Thomas was 2, Harriet and Clark were married 3 years, and the town of Redemption Creek had grown to almost 400 people. Pearl Chen had expanded the store, taken on 2 employees, and announced that she intended to buy the building outright before she turned 60, which no one who knew her doubted she would do. Elias had taken on an apprentice. Dr. Morse had delivered 7 babies in 18 months and was agitating successfully for a proper clinic building rather than the converted back room she currently worked from. When Thomas was 3, Harriet and Clark were married 4 years, and she was expecting again. Their second child was a boy as well, Jonas, born in May, smaller than Thomas had been, but with the same lungs, a detail that Clark observed from outside the bedroom door with a combination of relief and amusement. Jonas was quieter than his brother, more observational, given from very early on to watching things carefully before joining them, which Harriet recognized with a feeling of fond helplessness as a quality she had apparently contributed to the gene pool. With two small children in the house, life became simultaneously fuller and more complicated. The days shorter, the nights interrupted, the ordinary management of time requiring more negotiation. Clark took the night shifts with Jonas when Thomas had been particularly energetic during the day, and Harriet needed the sleep. She took the mornings when Clark had been on the evening rounds and had not come home until late. They managed it with the same practical honesty that managed everything between them, without martyrdom and without keeping score, because they had both learned by now that what worked was simply telling the truth about what you needed and trusting the other person to hear it. Pearl called them the most sensible couple she had ever seen, which she delivered as a compliment, but with the slight air of someone who found it mildly suspicious. "Most couples," Pearl said to Harriet one Tuesday afternoon over the ledgers, "are either very sweet or very practical. You and that marshal of yours are somehow both at the same time, which is either evidence of an unusual compatibility or evidence that neither of you is quite normal." "Both," Harriet said, which was the same word she had said to Prout 4 years ago, and which seemed to be the correct answer to a wide range of questions about her life. Clark Walker turned 35 in September of the year Jonas was 2. Harriet organized a gathering that he claimed he did not want and clearly enjoyed enormously, because the people who came were his people, the people who had been in Redemption Creek at the beginning, and who had watched the place become what it was becoming, and who knew Clark Walker in the way that a community knows the person it has trusted to hold it together. After everyone had gone home and the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, they sat on the small porch Clark had built the previous summer, looking at the September night. "You are not old," Harriet said, because he had been making quiet remarks about 35 all day. "I know," he said. "I am more alive than I have ever been, which makes 35 feel significant. 10 years ago I was a man who was not sure whether he was building something or just moving. And now I know," he said. "I am building something." She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat in the September quiet, the town murmuring its usual evening sounds at a comfortable distance. "Clark," she said. "Yes. I want you to know something." He turned slightly to look at her. "I came here for Thomas," she said. "I carried his letter and I followed his instructions because he asked me to, and because I loved him and I wanted to understand what had happened to him." "That is the truth." "I know," he said. "But I stayed for you," she said. "That is also the truth. Not because Thomas arranged it, not because I owed it to anyone. I stayed because you are the person I choose, every day. I want that to be something you know clearly and keep knowing." He looked at her in the way he had looked at her the night she had arrived, that first real look, the look of recognition, but without the grief and the shock underneath it. Just the recognition itself, pure and certain. "I know it," he said, "and I keep knowing it." He kissed her, not carefully this time but warmly and fully, and she kissed him back with the same completeness, and the September night held them in its particular quiet. 2 more years brought 2 more things. A new marshal's office, larger and better situated, that the town had collectively decided was overdue, and a third child, a daughter this time, whom they named Eleanor, known from approximately the 3rd week of her life onward as Ellie, because Thomas, who was 6, could not be discouraged from the diminutive and it suited her. Ellie was fair-haired, which came from somewhere in the hereditary line that nobody could immediately identify, and opinionated, which came from both lines simultaneously. She was also, from very early, given to a kind of concentrated affection. She loved the people she loved with an intensity that was visible from across the room, which made her either exactly like her father or exactly like her mother, depending on which parent you asked. "She is going to run something," Pearl said, observing Ellie at the age of 8 months directing the attention of everyone in the dry goods store with the authority of a person who has not yet been told that she is 8 months old. "The town, possibly," Clark said. Good, Pearl said. It needs it. Harriet wrote to Columbus at intervals that had become irregular as the years accumulated, not because she thought less of the people she had left behind, but because the life she was living was so continuous and so present that the letters felt like trying to summarize a river by sending a cup of water. Her friend from Columbus, whose name was Agnes, came west in the spring of the year Ellie turned 2, which was the year Thomas Walker turned 7 and Jonas turned 5, which was, Harriet calculated, 5.5 years after she had arrived in Redemption Creek with a letter in her hand, and found a gray-eyed marshal who had read it twice and asked her to sit down. Agnes arrived by stage and stood in the main street of Redemption Creek, looking around with the expression of someone who has been told a great deal about a place and is calibrating the described version against the actual version. "It is smaller than I imagined," Agnes said. "It is bigger than it was," Harriet said. "You look," Agnes said, turning to look at Harriet directly, "completely different from when you left." "I have had 3 children," Harriet said. "It is not that," Agnes said. "You look like you are exactly where you are supposed to be." Harriet thought about this. "I am," she said. Agnes met Clark that evening at supper and was visibly recalibrating again, this time in the direction of approval. "He listens," Agnes said later when Clark had taken the children to see the horses and they were sitting together with their tea. "He does," Harriet agreed. "Thomas," Agnes said carefully, "would be—" "I know," Harriet said. "I think about that. I think Thomas would be glad. I think that is what he was hoping for. He was always very thoughtful," Agnes said. "For a man who wrote a letter and sent it with a freighter instead of just saying the things himself." Harriet laughed. It was a real laugh, full of the complicated mixture of loss and love and time that was the emotional texture of Thomas Briggs's place in her life. Never gone, never a wound, just a presence in the way that someone you have loved properly is always a presence, incorporated into the fabric of who you became because of them. "That was very Thomas," she said. Agnes stayed for 2 weeks, which lengthened to 3 when the stage she was meant to leave on had a wheel problem, which lengthened to 4 when she developed a friendship with Dr. Morse that appeared to operate at the speed of a long-running correspondence between 2 people who had somehow managed to exist without knowing each other for 40 years. When she finally left, she stood in the street with her bag and looked at Harriet and Clark and the 3 children arranged around them in various degrees of being ready to say goodbye, and she said, "I understand now. I could not understand from the letters, but I understand now." "What do you understand?" Thomas asked with the 7-year-old directness of a boy named for a complicated idea. Agnes looked at him and then at his parents and said, "That sometimes the most frightening journey you can take is the one that leads you to exactly where you belong." Thomas considered this. "Mother came with a letter," he said. "She told me." "She did," Agnes said. "And the letter brought her here." "To us," Jonas said, with the 5-year-old conviction of someone identifying a fact that settles the matter. "Exactly," Agnes said, "to you." Ellie, not to be left out, said something emphatic in a combination of words and sounds that she was still in the process of fully organizing, but whose meaning, agreement, insistence on being included was unmistakable. Agnes got on the stage. Everyone waved. Thomas waved with both arms. Ellie waved at the dust. Clark picked Ellie up and she immediately redirected her attention to a button on his coat, and he stood in the street watching the stage go with the expression Harriet had come to associate with his contentment. Not the performed happiness of a man who has decided to be content, but the real kind. The kind that lives in the bones. That is simply the natural resting state of a person who is living a life that fits them. She stood beside him and he reached for her hand without looking. The automatic ease of it, the reflex of years. And she held his hand and they stood in the street with their 3 children, and the sun going down over the plains. There was a morning later that fall, when Harriet found herself alone in the marshal's office for the first time in years. Clark was dealing with a boundary dispute at the edge of town. Thomas was at school. Jonas was with Elias learning the names of tools. Ellie was with Pearl, who adored her, and she sat at the desk and looked around the room. The office was different from the first time she had been in it. Larger, as she had noted, with the expansion the town had undertaken. There was a second desk now, which she used when she was working on the paperwork side of things. There was a small bookcase with the law books and several other volumes, including a novel she had left there 3 weeks ago and not yet retrieved. There was a lamp she had brought from the house because the original lamp had been inadequate. There were 2 chairs for visitors, but the shape of it was the same. The window at the same angle, the light coming through it at 4 in the afternoon at the same particular slant. She thought about the woman who had sat in this room 6 years ago with her traveling bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap, waiting to find out what she had come all this way to find. She thought about the carefully folded letter, the carefully constructed silence, the gray eyes of a man who had not known yet that she would be the most important person in his life. She thought about Thomas Briggs, not with grief now, mostly, though the grief was still part of it. She thought about him with love and gratitude and the particular fondness that time and happiness bring to loss, the way the sharp edges soften without removing the reality of what they once were. She reached into the drawer of the desk because she had placed it there deliberately, carefully, years ago and found the letter. She unfolded it. She read it again. The first part, the love letter, was still what it had always been, honest and unguarded, and the voice of a man who had believed completely in the future. She read it and loved him, as she always did, with the finished quality of a love that knows its full shape because it has had the time to see it. The second part, the practical section, the information about Prout that had been dealt with, resolved, complete. And the last line, "Harriet, forgive me for asking you to do this. But Clark is the only honest man I have ever trusted with anything that mattered, and you are the only person I have ever loved. The 2 of you being in the same room together is the closest I will be able to get to being there myself." She folded the letter again along its creases. She thought about being in the same room together. She thought about the room they had been in since then, the rooms, all the rooms, the office and the hotel and the house and the town and the years themselves, all one long room that she and Clark had inhabited together, and that Thomas was in too, in the ways that mattered, in the name of their oldest child and in the quality of honesty that Clark brought to everything, and in the very fact that she was here at all. She put the letter back in the drawer. She picked up the pen and went back to work. The door opened. Clark came in with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who had spent the afternoon negotiating a fence line dispute and would like very much to be done with fence lines for the foreseeable future. He hung his hat on the peg, not the same peg as the first day. The original one had broken 2 years ago and been replaced, and came to stand beside the desk. "Everything all right?" he asked, looking at her. "Everything is very good," she said. He looked at her with the attention she had come to rely on, the way you rely on the ground being solid, the full, unhurried attention of a man who genuinely wants to know the answer. "You were thinking about him," he said, not a question. They had spent 6 years learning each other's faces. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He put his hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. "Me too," he said, "sometimes more than others." "Today more than others," she said. "What was it?" "Agnes," she said. "What she said to Thomas, about the most frightening journey being the one that brings you where you belong." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window the afternoon light was at its particular angle, and the street was doing its ordinary busy thing, horses, voices, the hammer on iron from Elias Place, the wind. "Are you glad you came?" he asked, which was not a question he had ever asked directly before in 6 years. She looked up at him. "Clark," she said, "I am the gladest I have ever been of anything in my life." He looked at her, and she saw all 6 years in his face. The grief and the honesty and the careful warmth and the joy and the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones and the children and the work and the thousands of small daily acts of choosing each other, and underneath all of it, still, the original recognition, The thing she had first seen in his eyes when he had looked at her across the desk in the very early days, and seen something he had not expected to find but whose existence made immediate sense. He leaned down and kissed her. The afternoon light held them in it. Outside, Redemption Creek went on being what it was, a real place, a rooted place, a place that had been built by people who had come from various distances and various degrees of desperation, and had chosen, against all sensible calculation, to stay. Inside, in the office where it had begun, where a letter had been read twice and a question had been answered with a simple sit down, the two people it had taken the longest to find each other sat together in the light, holding all that they had made from the material of loss and honesty and an ordinary love that had become, in the living of it, anything but ordinary. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.